Animation is not a new concept. The idea of putting together a series of drawings and flipping through them quickly to create the illusion of movement has been around for centuries. Of course, hand drawing enough frames to create a smooth animation takes an extreme amount of time and effort, so it was never really possible until our technology caught up to our ideas. The first fully animated film is called Phantasmagorie. Animated by Emily Cole, a French cartoonist, in 1907. Though this was the first fully animated film, it was not the first instance of animation in film. In 1896, Georges Méliès introduced the idea that pictures lasting no more than a single frame in quick succession would appear to be in motion. It would take about a decade before this idea was picked up by film producers. In the early 1900s, the idea of film becoming the main source of entertainment was rapidly growing in popularity, and it was no surprise that the love of comics in the morning newspapers translated to the fascination with animation. Many early animations are adaptations of comics, made by cartoonists. Not even 2 decades later, the infamous Walt Disney made Steamboat Willie in 1928, and was also the first animation to ever include sound. There's a reason why people consider Walt Disney to be the pioneer of animation, and it's not because of his popularity. The introduction of the beloved character, Mickey Mouse, definitely helped him soar on the popularity charts, but it was his revolutionary techniques which really caused him to get the reputation he has today. In 1937, he released Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. This 83-minute-long film was fully colored, completed with voice acting, and an original soundtrack. From there, animation, specifically Disney, rapidly evolved, with each new film being better than the last. Things remained on this pace until the 1950s, where computer animation finally became possible. It would take a long time before the first fully CGI film was released, but in 1995, Disney released the film Toy Story.
Woody, what are you doing?
Hold still, Buzz!
Disney signed a deal that they would make an entirely computered animated trilogy, but at the time, they hadn't even made one movie. Of course, when the movie was released, it had an overwhelming success, and is still seen as one of the best animated stories ever. Compared to the history of art, animation is an extremely new technique. Because of that, we are seeing the rapid evolution of animation before our eyes. We're also seeing the effects of animation on the people who watch it. Never before has storytelling been something so accessible. With the combination of the internet and easily accessible tools, just about anyone with an internet connection can tell their story. One method of storytelling is animation. Animation is a very labor-intensive process, and it was even more so when every single frame had to be drawn by hand. Because of this, animation studios couldn't afford to make a film that not everyone would like. So Western animation was primarily for kids or family-friendly content. This is where the stereotype, animation is for kids, came from. Of course, this stereotype almost exclusively exists in the Western societies. In places like Japan, Germany, and Sweden, animation geared towards a mature audience has been being made for decades. The history of film greatly differs from place to place, most notably in Japan. In the 1930s, cultural nationalism was at an all-time high in Japan. The government was enforcing strict censorship laws on all media, including animation. Many animated films made during World War II in Japan showed the power of the Japanese army and the imagery of Japan winning the war. Japanese animators thrived during this time, being commissioned to create propaganda and pro-war content. It's no surprise that the economic and political environment of Japan greatly influenced the content that was being produced. In the 1970s, Japan produced only 49 animated feature films. In the next decade, in the 1980s, 220 animated feature films were produced. If you were to go back now and watch many of the movies from this time, you'd realize a common theme between them: war. After strict censorship laws were lifted, Japan never stopped making films about war. But this time, the war was being painted in a much different light. We see stories of the war being told from the survivors, heart-wrenching stories about the loss everyone suffered, whether that be their homes or their family members. Animators were no longer tied down by the censorship laws, so many created explicit depictions of war. Artists suffered from first-hand experiences of the war. Many chose to channel their emotions into their artwork, which gave each piece a feeling of realism not many have experienced before. The sci-fi coming from Japan suddenly felt real, because a lot of it was based on real events that happened in Japan. This is the start of what many consider to be the golden age of anime. Japan was well in the middle of their economic boom during this time. For the first time since World War II, the idea of becoming a middle-class citizen became a reality, if you chose to. Because of this, the people of Japan had a lot of disposable income and time, which many chose to use creating and consuming anime. Anime was no fiscal boom, however. Anime had already existed, and many professionals had well over 30 years of experience in the field. In the 1980s, we see people who grew up with anime entering the fields as professionals. In these 10 years, between 1980 and 1990, we see some of the most highly praised animated films to ever come out of Japan. Studio Ghibli, arguably one of the most well-known Japanese animation studios, released many of what are now considered classics, such as Castle in the Sky, My Neighbor Totoro, Nausicaa, and Grave of the Fireflies. Other extremely influential films released in this time include Angel's Egg, Neo Tokyo, Dragon Ball, and of course, Akira. It's not an exaggeration when I say Akira changed animation. Like I mentioned, at the time of the film's release, there wasn't any expectations on what anime should or shouldn't be. The idea of anime was still abstract. Anime wasn't being made for anyone, therefore anyone could enjoy it. This is what really separated anime from Western animation. Look at any anime from the 80s and you'll see reoccurring themes of grotesque violence and hypersexuality. Animators would push the bounds of what people thought could be achieved by animation. All of this led up to the creation of Akira. Akira, visually, is jam-packed with detail. This comes as no surprise because the manga is just as detailed. Akira is animated on a mix of what's called ones and twos, meaning that scenes animated on ones have a unique picture for each frame, or 24 frames per second, and twos, meaning that every other frame has a unique picture, or 12 frames per second. Where most of the film is animated on twos, action and important, plot-driven scenes being animated on ones. This is now a common practice for many animes because it creates the illusion that the action scenes are more fluid and dramatic. Switching from twos to ones also tricks the viewers into becoming more engaged. With more for the brain to process, the viewer has to pay more attention. Akira, while using this common practice, is mainly animated on ones. This is because of how much action is happening in the movie. Switching between animating on ones and twos is not a new technique. It saves money and cuts down production time immensely, though Akira never traded quality for cheaper costs. Although CGI was gaining popularity in the late 80s and 90s, especially in sci-fi, Akira chose not to use it. Just about every movie was using some kind of CGI, whether it was the bubbles in the Disney classic The Little Mermaid, or the various machines and weapons in the Star Wars series. Akira could have easily used interpolation to create the movements of the buildings in the background, or 3D models of motorcycles instead of rendering each one by hand, but it didn't. One of the reasons some people find animation so compelling is because it is able to do things the real world cannot, no matter how much special effects are used. Take for example this short animation I did. On the right is one I did without using computer interpolation, where I drew every frame you are seeing. On the left is one with computer interpolation. This one I only drew the ball once and let the computer do the rest. While the one on the left may be smoother, it may even be more accurate, it doesn't have the same effect as the one on the right. A real ball would not create such motion blur, nor would it squash and stretch as much. But these things make it dynamic, and in turn more pleasing to look at. The most obvious example of this in the media is the Studio Ghibli hair float. If you've seen any of Miyazaki's movies, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Whenever a character gets excited or mad in a movie, their hair puffs out a bit. This is obviously not something that actually happens, and this is not something that a computer would have done without help, because computers run on logic, and it's not logical for hair to float when you get happy. But this is something Miyazaki did. It amplifies the emotions the characters are feeling tenfold and helps convey the seriousness of what the characters are feeling by giving them a physical reaction. Many things coming out of Japan stayed loyal to traditional animation much longer than the rest of the world. After Toy Story was released in 1995, we see a plethora of horrendous CGI animated films coming out of the West. This is because CGI started to be seen as a means to an end, instead of a tool to improve what's already there. We are now seeing the desire for traditional animation once again, with animation such as Arcane, The Dragon Prince, and Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse all using techniques to make their CGI animation look more reminiscent of traditional animation, such as the hand-drawn rendered look on the Arcane and Into the Spider-Verse, and The Dragon Prince, which chose to animate on twos, making it feel like traditional animation. This relationship between traditional and CGI animation has always been something unique to anime, until of course Akira became the first anime played on the big screens in America, becoming the catalyst to the eventual collision of Western and Japanese animation. While the golden age of anime is long gone, we are right in the middle of what I consider to be the golden age of Western animation. Quite a handful of TV shows being released between the early 2000s and now are following the path the Japanese paved of if you cater to no one, anyone can enjoy and relate to the content. Notable, and one of, if not the first, major piece created during this time is Avatar: The Last Airbender. Some of you may recognize this show to be just another kids' cartoons that aired every Wednesday on Nickelodeon. But this show set a precedent for many like it to come. In as little detail as possible, this show is about a boy named Aang who, for many reasons I will not get into, has to end the 100-Year War, which was the cause of the complete genocide of his people. Although this show is rated TVY7, meaning it's suitable for ages 7 and up, this show deals with serious themes such as themes of war, genocide, violence, death, discrimination, mental health, and many more. This show, even though it's almost 2 decades old, is still being praised for the genius storytelling and characters that are still being regarded as some of the best in all of fiction. This show is not the last of its kind, being followed by shows such as its sequel, The Legend of Korra, as well as The Dragon Prince, the 2016 reboot of Voltron Legendary Defender, and the 2018 reboot of She-Ra Princess of Power. All of these shows, geared towards kids, deal with similar themes of war and grief, reminiscent of the themes anime from the 80s dealt with. It makes sense that we're seeing the West imitate what the Japanese did. Many producers grew up with and were inspired by anime created in the 80s, and many of the producers openly admit to their affinity for anime and how it's inspired them to create the work they have. Of course, the West is still producing Western content, and we always will. Animation will always be used as a money-grabbing technique, by making film with the sole purpose of making marketable toys instead of making film to be enjoyed. But we're starting to see change, and the stigma of animation only being for kids is quickly starting to die out in the West. And with that comes better, new content. Films where distracting kids is no longer the goal. Films where there are options for everyone to enjoy, regardless of your age or interests.